Fa molta il·lusió ser aquí per moltes raons. Una, perquè hi ha bastanta gent dins del que ens permet la Covid-19. He de dir que el dia que em va trucar la Judit Carrera i em va dir si volia venir a conversar amb el Patrick Radden Keefe, vaig pensar que tenia molta sort. A la vida tens cops de sort, no? I aquest n'és un, perquè parlar amb un periodista d'investigació sobre el periodisme d'investigació després de veure i llegir l'impacte d'aquestes dues obres, doncs és un privilegi. Teniu aquí les dues edicions que hi ha en aquests moments en castellà, traducció. Jo vull dir els traductors, perquè els traductors són molt importants. La traducció a Reservoir Books és de l'Albino Sánchez, el Francesc Pedrosa i el Jesús Negro, i aquí el teniu. I la traducció de les edicions catalanes, tant del No diguis res com de l'Imperi del dolor, són del Ricard Gil, que si no m'erro, a més ha vingut. Oi, Ricard? Està per aquí? Sí. Doncs moltes felicitats, Ricard. Per tant, felicitats a Reservoir Books i també a Periscopi per aquestes edicions tan magnífiques que superen l'anglesa, que és pesa molt menys, ja us ho dic, però està aquí, també. La teva original està aquí. El Patrick, ahir vam estar parlarem del periodisme d'investigació, de com treballa ell. A mi em sembla una qüestió apassionant. Demà ell serà a Madrid. La Fundació Telefònica el porta a Madrid i farà una altra xerrada allà, pel qui tingui interès a seguir-ho, a les 7 del vespre. I d'avui, després d'una marató d'entrevistes que ha fet des que va arribar ahir al matí, que no sé com estarà, esgotat, doncs parlem amb ell. De moment parlarem en anglès, vosaltres teniu accés a la traducció, estic segura que la majoria de vosaltres no ho necessiteu, però potser vaig canviant en funció de com estigui jo de torpe a l'hora de parlar en anglès. Welcome, Patrick. Thank you for being here. It's very nice. I was telling them that it was an honor, that I am lucky to be talking to you about journalism, how to investigate your topics. And the first question I would put across is, how do you choose the topic you are going to get into? Because before you've written these two magnificent books, you've wrote an article in the New Yorker, and then afterwards you felt the need to go farther. How did you choose Say Nothing, The Empire of Pain, the topics in which you work in?
I should first of all say thank you, Monica. Thank you for being here. It's my honor to talk with you, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to the CCCB, this amazing place, for hosting us this evening. It's been an incredibly warm welcome in Spain, and I'm very grateful to readers of both of these editions. So I have written for the last 15 years for the New Yorker magazine, and there's a lot of freedom for me as a journalist writing for the magazine. I don't have a particular topic that I write about. I can sort of pick my subjects in conversation with my editors, and then often spend quite a lot of time, a luxurious amount of time, I think probably it is fair to say, in the world of journalism, particularly now, where I'll spend 4 months, usually at a minimum 4 months, and sometimes as much as a year on an article.
You are lucky.
It is lucky, it is. And most of the time what happens is I finish the piece and I'm ready to move on. You know, I don't stay in the area. I think some people, my wife is a lawyer, and she hates it when she starts a new job and she feels like she's not an expert. You know, she feels it takes a while, always she feels some anxiety, and she wants to kind of know where everything is. And for me, as soon as I know where everything is, I get bored. I lose interest, and I start looking for the next thing. And so that's one of the nice things about doing these pieces, is that I'll do the piece and then I move on. But occasionally there are these stories where I feel as though there's something deeper. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's the tip of the iceberg. You know, you feel as though even a long piece in the magazine doesn't really capture a deeper truth. And so those are the ones that I want to explore at greater length.
I was wondering if the reason was that for both of them. You haven't had the opportunity to speak to some of the main characters. Jerry Adams, you couldn't speak to him and say nothing, and the Sacklers wouldn't give you an interview whatsoever.
Yeah.
Say, we don't want to see this man near us. And then you say, look, I'm going to write about you both.
Well, I mean, maybe, I suppose. Yeah, you could you could call both of these books "Don't Say Anything." But in some ways, that's been a theme in my career. I mean, even the articles that I've written, very often, there's a wonderful phrase in English that American journalists use for this, where they call these types of articles, they call them write-arounds.
Yeah.
The idea being the person in the center of the story won't talk to you, so you write around them. And a lot of editors and journalists don't like those stories, and when they are interested in writing about somebody, if the person says, no, I won't cooperate, I won't give an interview, they say, oh, well, we won't write about them. At the New Yorker, we have these meetings on Tuesday afternoons to talk about what articles should be in the magazine, the ideas meeting. And every few months, you'll be at an ideas meeting and somebody will say, what about Beyonce? Wouldn't she be an amazing profile? And somebody else will say, she'll never give us an interview.
Yeah.
We keep asking, and she says no. And then they say, all right, well, we won't write about her. And for me, I like to write those types of pieces. You have to be creative, and you have to do some extra work in order to paint the picture. But I actually think, strangely enough, sometimes there are pieces that are better because you don't have access. I had a former colleague at the New Yorker, George Packer, who's a great writer, who's actually spoken here, I believe. Mm-hmm. He did one of what I think is one of the best political profiles of all time that he wrote probably 10 or 15 years ago about Angela Merkel. Mm-hmm. She didn't give him access. And if you read the profile, it's amazing because he talks to everybody who's known her and they have all these opinions. And you realize that if she gave him an interview, it would have been so boring because he would have had to use all the things she said. And she's so dry in her presentation that not having access made it better. So for me, this is the write-around is actually something I'm quite fond of.
Yeah, in the case of the Empire of Pain, in which you've had access to thousands of documents from the courts, from everything, you know pretty well, and you've been speaking to all their surroundings, the doorman, the housekeeper, everyone. You managed to get an idea of the psychological movements of these people, how they behave, and everything. In the case of Jerry Adams, you needed to know what he had done, in fact, related to Jane Mcconville's mother. This different feeling that you had not having access to Jerry Adams or to the Sacklers, you felt that it was different altogether?
Well, I mean, you always try. You always try to talk to these people. And I certainly tried with Adams, and I tried with the Sacklers. They are different in the sense that most of the Sacklers have never given any interviews to anyone at all. So that's one type of person, somebody who just doesn't speak to the press. They don't give interviews. You can't imagine what they would say. Jerry Adams is different because he's given hundreds, thousands of interviews. And he's written all these books. He's written multiple different memoirs. And so with him, I actually had a lot that I could work with, things that he said to other people. But there's a funny thing about that, which is that Adams, and this is part of what's so fascinating about him, he's very clever, and in all these different interviews, he's very controlled. So I had a funny conversation with somebody, if any of you have read Say Nothing, there's a minor character in the book, Mackers, Anthony McIntyre, who did the interviews, a former IRA man who did the interviews in the Boston College Project. And I had a funny conversation with him back when it looked like Jerry Adams might talk to me. And I said, very confidently, I said, oh, I'm excited to interview Adams. I think I'm gonna get him to admit some things. And Mackers just kind of laughed at me, chuckled a little bit. And I was offended because I thought, I'm a serious journalist. I have my ways, and I've interviewed many, many tough interview subjects before. And And Mackers sort of laughed and he said, you know, the thing about Jerry is, Jerry has done what we, in the IRA, we used to call counter-interrogation training.
Yeah.
What that means is, you could be torturing him and he wouldn't tell you what you want to know. And I was taking notes as he said this, and he looked at me and he said, but if you want to go in there with your wee notebook and see if you can get him to answer your questions, you know, good luck to you. So I think Adams is different in that respect, you know, in that he, there are a few interviewers who I think have gotten really interesting admissions from him, but in thousands of interviews, I think just a few.
Yeah. And how do you choose the main characters? Because I'm sure when you get to write big pieces like that and say nothing is two women, Jen Mcconville and Dolores Price, the two main characters of your book, who suffer both in different ways, and the Sacklers clearly, Arthur, Richard, and some of them you say, this is not going to be a main character. I would like to know why, because I was fascinated by the role of Grace Wright with the guy from the Drugs and Food Administration, because I think it's another side of the guilt thing of the opioids crisis. I mean, the Food and Drug Administration gave the permission to the Sacklers to produce OxyContin. It was not interesting, this guy, Grace Wright,
I mean, he was.
to pursue him.
Yeah, he was, and I tried. I talked to him for about 3 minutes. I talked to him for as long as it took him to hang up the phone. I tried. I think, I'm glad you used the word characters, because this is the way I think of them, which is a strange thing to say when you're talking about real life. But I do think of, you know, I have another colleague at the New Yorker who talks about casting a story the way you would cast a movie. You have to pick your characters. And it's always some combination of things. I mean, sometimes you have a character who's just a great character. Arthur Sackler is a great character. Dolores Price is a great character. They're rich, they're interesting, they change, they have the qualities of a character in a novel. But sometimes you encounter somebody who seems like a great character, but you have very little to work with. And so Curtis Wright is a good example. Curtis Wright, you know, Arthur Sackler was dead by the time I started writing about him, same with Dolores Price. I could tell they were fascinating, but I needed to do a lot of work in order to construct them and make them feel vivid and three-dimensional. Curtis Wright, it's difficult because he wouldn't talk to me. There weren't that many people who knew him. The people who did know him didn't have very interesting memories to share about him. So he becomes kind of a situational character. You know, I'm not in his head. I don't know why he did what he did. And so he gets, in a way, demoted to a minor role. But then there are people like Jean Mcconville. And what's interesting with her is, I would argue that Jean Mcconville is not a great character. She's a symbol. I mean, in the book, she drives a lot of what happens. But the truth is, we know very little about this woman. I was not able to get really into her head, into her life. This is somebody who was a mother of 10 in Belfast in the 1970s, whose husband dies of cancer. She's in a flat. She's inside an apartment. She rarely leaves. She didn't have much of a social life. She left no writing. There's only one photo of her. And so that was a challenge for me as a writer in the book, because on the one hand, she's this kind of iconic victim. On the other hand, it's very difficult to evoke who she was in life, even when you talk to her children, because she disappeared when many of them were so young, and so their memories of her are almost more impressionistic than anything else. And so even having interviewed her children and asked about her, you know, I did everything I could to bring her alive, but I think if you were to look at the raw number of pages in Say Nothing that are about Jean Mcconville, where you're hearing about things she's doing, it's not much at all. Compared to Dolores Price, who I feel like I understand that woman's interior life in a way that I could kind of bring it across on the page.
When we were speaking yesterday with Patrick Radden Keefe, we were saying that you choose a way of looking at the problem. They are these both problems, the IRA, the troubles in Northern Ireland, and the opioids crisis are complex and huge problems. But you choose this way of looking at it. In that case, in the IRA, you choose one case which is unsolved, and that involves a murder in the IRA, because they shoot Mcconville. And in the case of the opioid crisis, you choose to put the stress on the family, on the company, on the private company, not on the system, on the public system, where it's inside the story. That's what I was asking about Food and Drug Administration, but it's a way of looking at it. Why is that so? Why you didn't choose British, how the British behave in Northern Ireland, or how the loyalists, or how the administration in the United States were negligible, because they were, with the OxyContin? Why?
The first thing I would say is that I think that I'm quite selfish as a writer, in a way, in the sense that I want to follow the stories that interest me, and those are the stories that I want to write. And often people will say to me explicitly or by implication, sometimes book reviewers do this, if there are any book reviewers out there, I really wish you'd written this other book that I have in mind. And my reaction is always, well, no, I wanted to write the book that I wanted to write. And it doesn't need to be all things to all people, but this is the perspective that I found interesting. And for me, I'm very drawn to stories, to narratives, and those are necessarily narratives about people. So, you know, if you tell me to read this great article about astrophysics, I will probably not read that article. I have to be honest with you. If you tell me that you just read a great article about an astrophysicist and her life and what she's done with her career and her family and the conflicts that she feels, I'll read that article. I think that we are hardwired as humans to be drawn to stories of other humans making decisions and being in conflict. And so I think that that's a powerful mechanism for getting people to engage with issues and subjects that they might not otherwise engage with. You know, I don't know what would be the case for people here who may have read one of these two books we're talking about, but I can tell you, particularly with Say Nothing, I've heard from many, many, many readers who said, I had no interest in Northern Ireland, I had no interest in the Troubles, I was engaged by the story of these people, and that drew me in, and then suddenly I was learning about this subject, but I never set out to read a book about the Troubles. And for me, that's a mission accomplished, right? That's what I wanted to do. And so I hope that you can kind of embed in the bigger story a lot of these smaller stories, so about the FDA, about systemic corruption. You know, there are some people who, when it comes to Say Nothing, they say, well, how could you tell this story about this one atrocity carried out by the IRA? That's a biased choice. Now you need to write a book about the Unionists or about British imperialism. But of course, the first thing I would say to that is, I'm going to write the book I'm going to write. I'm not out here to satisfy anybody's political agenda.
Somebody else would do it.
Somebody else will do it. By all means, you write that book. I'll read it. But I don't necessarily have to do it. But then the other thing I would say is, if you read Say Nothing closely, nested in that book is a lot of talk about British imperialism and about violence by loyalist paramilitaries and collusion by the British state. In some ways, I think for me, the measure of the success of that book is that most people who have some vested political interest in Northern Ireland like some parts of the book and are made uncomfortable by other parts of the book. And to me, if there was any one constituency that said, you've written my Bible, he said it all, I completely agree with everything, none of it makes me uncomfortable, I would feel as though I actually hadn't done my job as an objective person trying to tell that story. And it's the same thing here. I mean, there are, I chose very deliberately not in Empire of Pain not to write a story that was centered on victims, but it was centered on perpetrators.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there aren't victims in the story.
Of course they are. You are a journalist, and when we read these books, we are reading an investigation, but you write it as fiction. So the reader goes passionately through the book, feeling that you are unveiling lots of things, and you are within the book with a story that could be fiction. Tomorrow will be a nice film and a TV series, I'm for sure both will be. And at some point, you need to know what that comes from. And the notes are at the end of the book, but you don't get the relationship between the page in which you are reading and the note that is at the end. Why so? Because this drives me crazy.
Does it?
Yeah. Yes, because you are reading, you want to know, and I don't know how to place the notes.
Oh, it shouldn't be too hard. I mean, if you're on any given page, you turn, the pages are listed, and then you look for the phrase. You should be able to find it. So it's very important to me to write books that are not academic books. They're not books for specialists. I hope that they have the kind of rigor that you would expect in a book for specialists or an academic book. But I want them to be accessible for anyone, even people who have no interest in the subject. Even people, and this is I often hear this from readers, even people who don't usually read nonfiction. There are a lot of people who really just prefer to read fiction. They don't read nonfiction books. And I want it to be inviting and accessible for those people as well. But I also want to show my work. And for the people who want to engage on that level, I want those answers to be there. In the case of the Sacklers, for the people who might be inclined to sue me or to threaten to sue me or bring legal action of some sort, I want them to be able to look at each assertion that I make and see where I got it. So the image that I sometimes use when I'm thinking about this is the image of a duck. So if you're looking at a duck floating on a pond, you see the duck above the water, and it's just floating serenely along and just gliding along the surface of the water. But we know that underneath the water, the duck is furiously paddling like this in order to do it. And when you see the duck above the water, there's no friction, there's no paddling, you don't see anything. And underneath the water, there's all this furious work. So for me, the end notes of the book, that's the paddling. And if you want to see it, it's there for you to see. And if you question, if there's some detail and you think, oh, this couldn't be real or he must make this up, you can look and you can check my work. But I think the truth is, you're a journalist as well, so you're interested in how does he know this, in doing the kind of due diligence on me. But for many, many readers, they don't care. They're never going to look at the notes. All they want to look at is the duck above the water. They want to kind of be immersed and take the journey and not give too much thought to how I know it. And for some of them, just knowing that there are all those notes back there that they're never going to look at, but that the notes exist, they think, all right, I'll trust him. And they don't need to look, but it's there in case they want to.
Strange way to tell me that I'm like a dog. Okay. And then we do have, both books have lots of things in common. One of it is the denial. There's a lot of denial in the first book, in Say Nothing. There's denial in Sackler's life. The family says, no, I don't know nothing. I've done nothing wrong. What about the denial? It's something that brings you through the book all the time, and for you it's important to face it.
Yeah, I don't know why, but this is a theme that I keep coming back to, not just in these books. I mean, it's strange. I'm working right now on a collection of stories from The New Yorker that will be published next year. And so I'm picking these stories to go in. And there are these other stories where, again, the theme is denial again and again. It's often denial in families, but where people have terrible experiences, or sometimes they do terrible things. And I'm just very interested in the stories that they tell themselves, kind of at every level, right? It's like, if you have somebody who's done a bad thing, and they wake up in the morning and they look at themselves in the mirror, what's the story that they tell themselves about who they are? There's an expression in Hollywood that I've always liked, that among screenwriters in Hollywood who write movies, where they say, it's kind of a piece of advice for screenwriting. They say that the villain in the movie doesn't think that he's the villain in the movie. He thinks he's the hero in the movie. And if you write the villain in the movie thinking he's the villain in the movie, it's not going to be a very convincing villain. And to me, that move in which you take your own decisions and you translate them into a narrative in which you're not the villain is interesting. And then what if it's in a family and it's a mother telling herself the same thing about her own child? That her child is the villain, but the mother doesn't want to believe that the child is a villain. So what's the story? And I think it happens at the level of a community. I think it can happen in a group like the IRA. Listen, I mean, at the broadest level, in the United States right now, we're having big debates about our own history, about the legacy of slavery, and I think there are many Americans who cannot abide by an idea that the United States could be the villain, right, in the story. They have real trouble even today, kind of wrapping their minds around that concept. So I think as a theme, that's something I'm very drawn to. And you're right, it's a connection between these two books.
How much truth you can bear of your own life? How much truth the IRA can assume when they get the Good Friday agreements in 1998 and say, look, if we look back and try to assume what we've done, we won't move forward. And the same for the British, the same for the whole conflict needs to go farther. And for the Sacklers, the thought of assuming that they are the responsible for how many? 500,000 deaths of overdose of OxyContin. You cannot sleep with that, so denial.
Yeah, I mean, I should say overdoses, just to be clear, in case any Sackler lawyers are in the audience. Overdose is not just from OxyContin, but other opioids. Yeah. But OxyContin was the one that started it.
Right, because they carry on with your putting you on the court.
The surveillance. Yeah, well, we'll see.
But you haven't got there still.
Yeah,
Not yet.
We'll see. Yeah, I think. Look, I think that's right. There's a kind of. I mean, here's the thing. I always try and feel some compassion and try and understand people, even if they are the villains in my story, even if they won't cooperate with me. And so in the case of the Sackler family, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a family that the book certainly argues has a lot of responsibility for this public health crisis that has killed so many people, but they're also very wealthy and very powerful, and they insist that they're completely innocent. They just agreed to a settlement where they're going to pay $4.5 billion to help with the opioid crisis, but they also say that they're innocent. They're paying it out of the kindness of their hearts. I do think when I look at them, I think that they probably, I think I can understand on an emotional level why you wouldn't open the door even a crack to the idea that you could have that sort of responsibility, because if you do, then imagine the guilt that comes rushing in. I think it would be paralyzing. And in the same way, Dolores Price, who did such terrible things as a young woman, there's a moment at the end of Say Nothing where I talk about how, in her memory, she describes Jean Mcconville as this kind of foul-mouthed, awful woman who was kind of boasting and talking about how the IRA wouldn't have the balls to do anything to me. And it's hard, right? Because I have an account from Dolores Price saying that that's what Jean Mcconville said. And I wasn't in the car with them, so I don't know. but I wanted to insert a little bit of doubt in the book because I just don't believe it. I don't believe that story. You know, Mcconville is being driven around by the IRA, having been interrogated. I just didn't believe that anybody would be so reckless as to talk that way. And so what I said in the book is I think maybe this is a story that Dolores Price told herself about this woman who she helped kill. Is that she was an awful woman, and right to the end she was saying terrible things. Maybe it's easier to live with yourself if that's the picture that you paint of this person, this innocent person who you helped execute.
Yeah, and I was thinking what you were saying, I didn't believe her. I didn't believe her. You've been interviewing hundreds of people to write down these books, in which cases you say, you know, I don't believe this version. You know, I don't believe this man. I believe this woman. I gave credit to this, or I don't give credit to that. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think there's a bunch of things that I do. So one of the things is if they're alive, I try and interview people multiple times. And the important stuff, I'll go back and ask them again and again. It's almost like an interrogator does, where they keep asking, you know, to see if your story checks out, if it's consistent. I'll try and find contemporaneous people, other people who were there, and cross-check. I'll see if I can find any documentary stuff. I'll see if there are other people that they told closer to the time who I can check with. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a story and just ask if it's plausible. There's a moment in Empire of Pain where I'll try and make this not too complicated for those of you who haven't read the book, but Arthur Sackler is this big character in the first third of the book. He's this amazing guy. He's part of the original 3 Sackler brothers. Charismatic. He was a doctor. He was a businessman. And he had these 2 brothers. And then in book 2, his nephew, Richard Sackler, is a big character.
Worst.
Yeah, well, and I won't disagree with you there. And I interviewed Richard Sackler's college roommate a bunch of times. And he told this story about being in college, and Richard invited him to lunch with their Uncle Arthur. And the family, especially Arthur, were very obsessed with all things Chinese. And so they went to a fancy Chinese restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. And this is in the 1960s. And this guy, Richard Sackler's roommate, told me that Arthur Sackler, what he told me is that Arthur Sackler, there was a very attractive woman who was the waitress. She was a Chinese waitress who was serving lunch. What he told me is that Arthur Sackler propositioned the waitress at lunch and made her very uncomfortable. That he suggested that they get out of there and get a hotel room or something. And everything else this guy said I believed, but that just rang a little false with me. And so what I did was I went to a bunch of people who knew Arthur at that time, and I said, could you see him doing this? They weren't there, but does it seem to you like it could happen? And some of them said, yeah, I can see him doing it. But others said, oh, I don't know, but he might have hit on her, he might have flirted with her, but I don't think it would go to the point where he's suggesting that they go and sleep with each other. And so what I did was I sort of downgraded the anecdote in the story, and I said he hit on her just because it was a kind of a question of, now it's not to say that this man is lying, but sometimes somebody doesn't have to be lying if you're asking them about their memory of something that happened 50 years ago.
That takes me to ask you about this, about the private stuff in the book on Sackler's family, because you do know that they had good sex with Marietta, the second wife, because there's a line in which you say that for her it was compensating because they had great sex. How come did you get to check these things? Because, I mean, no, what I wanted to ask is, when do you think it's relevant, the private life? Because I was feeling sometimes uncomfortable reading it, saying,
oh, good.
You know,
why do I need to know
I
this?
don't want to know their lives. I want to know if they've planned rationally to intoxicate, to get everyone taking OxyContin or MS-Contin or Valium and Librium, the drugs that Arthur Sackler was marketing before OxyContin because he was not there anymore. The line between the private information that you give to us that are not relevant to the topic, but you put inside, is your novel talent into it, even if it's non-fiction.
No, listen, I think about this all the time. I thought about this subject actually just earlier this week because this precise question came up. Because on the one hand, as a storyteller, I have an imperative to want to get as close as I can. And I take a certain pride in telling you about the vigorous sex life of Arthur Sackler and his second wife.
The second one. We don't know anything about the first one and the third one.
I'll venture no comment on that. And I think that brings you into the story. It brings you into the bedroom. It's hard to get more intimate with them as characters. And in that case, the source, if you flip to the back, is that Marietta.
You have to go to the note.
Marietta, the second wife, they ended up, she was the second wife, but not the last wife. And they had a very unhappy divorce. And she ended up writing when she was much older and privately publishing a very dishy memoir in which she talked about her life with Arthur. And there were only ever, I think, 200 copies made. Beautiful, just cloth-bound, gorgeous book. And I found one on eBay that must have belonged to someone or other, and they sold it. And so that was where I got that kind of detail. And I should say it was easier for me in terms of invasion of privacy that both of them were dead by the time I'm writing this. And that she had, I mean, it wasn't published in the sense that anybody could go to the library, but she had disclosed this already. There are other kinds of details. There was I wrote a short piece in the New Yorker on the website this week. The piece is based on a book that's going to be coming out in a month or so by somebody who was involved in the bankruptcy proceeding, somebody who had inside information about the Sacklers. And one of the details that I put in the piece is that David Sackler, who's a third-generation Sackler who worked for the company, has, according to this book, he has struggled with alcohol and with gambling. And I gave a lot of thought to this because there's other details in the piece, for instance, about his marriage that I did not, or in the book, that I did not put in the piece because it felt to me this is an invasion of this person's privacy that has no bearing on the story that I'm telling. David Sackler's around, he has young kids. I'm not necessarily any great fan of his, and I write critically about him in my book. But there's a certain kind of coverage that feels too far and not helpful. So why would I publish that he struggled with alcohol and gambling? Well, first of all, it's an easier decision for me because I know that this book is coming out in a few weeks that will tell the world this anyway. So it's not as though I'm, it won't come out without me doing it. But second, it's about addiction. That this is a family that has been very callous about addiction for other people. And it's fascinating to think that they might have actually had issues with addiction themselves. And it complicates our understanding of the way in which they talk about addiction for others if they too have struggled with these issues. And I say this, all of us know people who've struggled with addiction of one sort or another. So I don't mean to suggest those decisions are easy, but I would say to you that anytime I'm putting a personal detail like that, I give a lot of thought, and I talk to my editors and my lawyers and my wife, and think very hard about what's appropriate to put in and what's not.
And Arthur Sackler was addicted to as a collector. I mean, one of the arguments of Sackler's family is everyone can be addicted to something.
Yeah.
And he is addicted to win and possess. And this is and I think when you explain all this obsession of him to possess the Chinese collection and to collect recognizements, he is in fact designing what Raymond and Mortimer are going to do in the business. I mean, I think this is relevant. Some details in private life, I think they are not, but it wouldn't read that well if you wouldn't have put all this stuff on it. That's the reason why you put.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, there's I almost didn't write this book because when I first published the article in 2017, I felt that there wasn't enough material to make you feel close to these people, as if you were in the room with them. And if I couldn't have gathered that kind of material to bring them alive as characters, I just wouldn't have written the book. I would have written another book or done something else. For whatever reason, it's the kind of writing I like to do, and honestly, part of the reason I like to do it is that it's the sort of reading as a reader that I like to read, is where the kind of depth and the texture is such that you really feel like you know these people. So yeah, I needed, there's all kinds of things that I left out of the book. There's crazy things I know about Richard Sackler that I did not put in the book.
Oh, tell us.
I'm afraid I can't tell you. Some because it might get me in legal trouble, some because I don't want to burn the sources. You know, sometimes a source tells you a story which is so crazy and you're desperate to use it, but if you use the story, there's only one person who could know, and you're gonna expose that person. So there's all sorts of things that I left out, but those kinds of details I think for me are important, and I know from talking to people who've read the book, and also just again myself as a reader, sometimes there's a book you read 10, 12 years ago, and you sort of remember the broad outlines, but often what you'll remember is an image or a line. And it's almost as if the whole book becomes kind of crystallized in this one thing that just sticks with you. And those are the things I'm always looking for. Yeah. And I think often those are the things that are quite intimate, quite personal.
For me, in that book, in The Part of Pain, the moment in which Isaac, the father of Arthur, says when he's going to die, you can recover the fortune if you... It's not this sentence exactly because I don't remember, and I'm not going to look at it because it will be. But Isaac is the father of Arthur, the three Sacklers. And he says, look, you can recover the fortune, pots recuperar la fortuna, but if your name goes down the tube, you will never recover the honor. And that's exactly what happened with these people. I mean, of course, they've been punished with this amount of money, $4.5 billion, but they are going to take their names out of the buildings in the Met as well. I think they are thinking of it.
Well, we don't know for sure. So the Sackler name has started to come down from some of these institutions that they put their name up on over the decades. The Louvre in Paris took the name down, the Sackler name. New York University took the name down. The Serpentine Gallery in London, which some of you may have visited, at a certain point it became the Serpentine Sackler Gallery because they gave so much money that it was renamed after them. Now it's just the Serpentine Gallery again. But the big one that everybody's watching is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and some of you, I'm sure, have been to the Met. There's this beautiful wing of the Met where there's an ancient Egyptian temple that they reconstructed. They took it from the banks of the Nile and they rebuilt it in the 1970s inside the museum, and there's this glass wall looking out at Central Park. It's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places in New York City. It's called the Sackler Wing. And it's named after the three brothers, and we don't know what's going to happen. The Met has announced that they are going to make a decision soon about whether or not they'll keep the name. But the one encouraging sign I thought was that there was an interview that the director of the Met gave last week, and he was asked what's going to happen with the Sackler name, and he wouldn't give anything away. He said, "Well, we don't know yet. It remains to be seen. A decision will come soon." But I have been reading this book, Empire of Pain, and I was pleased to think that as they make the decision, they might consult the book.
And that brings another question, that is, you wrote these books and how things have changed afterwards. I mean, you think you've been able to socialize more the crisis, the opioid crisis, with people, because you've had a lot of feedback from people who's lost their kids or their young people from overdose of OxyContin plus blah, 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 all the other drugs, because maybe there are lawyers here. And in Say Nothing, it's difficult because it was already an investigation going on. But you think something has changed after your books?
I mean, yes and no. I think having done investigative journalism for a while now, I think the truth is that most of the time you don't change the world, you describe it. And then sometimes you do, you change it in some small way. And I think that it's a noble thing just to try. And I think it's a noble thing just to describe it. There's a line that I often think about. It's a second-hand line, so I don't know that she actually said it exactly like this, and even though I know her, I haven't checked with her, and I should. But I like my version of it, which is that I have a colleague named Elizabeth Kolbert. She's a great, great writer, and she writes primarily about climate change. And she was being interviewed by Ta-Nehisi Coates, another great American writer. And this is the version that was relayed to me. What he said to her was, you know, he said, you do this amazing work on climate change, but you can't stop it. It's still happening. You're not changing behavior, really. So, you know, how do you justify it to yourself? Like, what do you tell yourself about what you do? How do you not get discouraged? And what she told him, in the version that was relayed to me, is she said, you know, I think of it as like a message in a bottle, so that afterwards, people will look back and they'll know it's not that we didn't know. And, you know, I think this is a very beautiful idea. And I think it's a noble idea. That if you see something wrong in the world, you try and write about it, and you do what you can to, you know, to stop the apocalypse. But just because you're writing your books or your articles, it doesn't mean that you will. And I think for any of us who do this work, that's a kind of existential dilemma. You know, all the other things you could be doing with your life. So I think in the case of the book and my work on the Sacklers, I think it has made a difference. I think that I think it was always going to be a story in which they ended up getting away with it in the end. It wasn't a scenario in which some writer can deliver justice. But I do think that their legacy is just different now than it was when I started writing about this. And for as long as any of them are alive, and hopefully long after, there will be this book between two covers that tells a version of their family story that's different from the version that they've always told about themselves. There was somebody I spoke to who I cannot name, who was involved in this whole crisis, and what they said to me was, this thing is going to be like a piece of gum stuck to my shoe for the rest of my life. And I realize it's a strange and maybe very modest ambition for me to articulate to all of you, but if my work can be that piece of gum, then I feel like I'm doing something right.
Yes, but because for the Food and Drug Administration, it is that piece of gum in the shoes. I mean, they've made any pressure on you for you not to write this book? They've been trying to stop you from investigating the case?
Food and Drug Administration?
Food and Drug Administration. They've given you full access to all? No. They've done something later on saying, look, Patrick,
No, it's
we
crazy.
misbehave. We misbehave here.
No, they didn't
No.
do that. I mean, it's shocking. But so, okay, well, I'll tell you about the Food and Drug Administration, but then there's one other thing I want to say about that. So for those of you not familiar with the book, the Food and Drug Administration approved OxyContin in 1995 and approved it for sale, but also approved the ways in which it could be marketed. And importantly, it approved a claim that the drug might be less addictive or less prone to abuse than other opioids that were available. This was a lie.
Without checking.
Yeah, without checking. I mean, nobody even looked into this. It was a guess. And they signed off on this, and then the guy at FDA who signed off on it went to work at Purdue Pharma for 3 times his government salary. And this is Curtis.
Chris, right.
And I think the FDA bears a lot of responsibility in this story. And when I went to try and write about this, I used the Freedom of Information Act in the US to try and get them to turn over old documents to me. And they were not particularly cooperative. So I sued them in federal court. I had a lawyer and I sued them to force them to turn over the documents. And I got a judge in New York to order the FDA to give me thousands of pages of documents. And this was a whole long process, more than a year. And then when they were finally forced to turn over the documents, I said, I want all the communications of that guy, Curtis Wright. Because if he went to work at Purdue Pharma after he signed off on the drug for all this money, when did they start having conversations? Was he still working at the agency when they started talking about this? And the FDA came back to me, this is just last year, and they said, they'd been ordered by a judge to give me this stuff. And they came back and they said, we don't have anything to give you on Curtis Wright. We'll give you all these other documents, but on Curtis Wright, we don't have anything because all of his documents have either been lost or destroyed. So that to me is not an institution that has learned from its mistakes.
And that should be prosecuted because of that.
I mean, I would think so, yeah, that they have responsibility there. But this is what I was going to say. It's an institution, it's not individuals. And so I think when you look at accountability, and I'm sure this is as true in Spain as it is in the US, institutions are bulletproof. People are the ones you have to go after and scrutinize and make feel like there will be consequences. Because at the end of the day, people retire, they move on. There's a story I tell at the end of my book about how just in 2020, last year, Purdue Pharma pled guilty for a second time to criminal charges that they were over-promoting OxyContin and other opioids. But there were no executives named or prosecuted, just the company. So the company pled guilty, and the company paid billions of dollars in penalties.
But not the Sacklers.
But not the Sacklers.
Not the executives.
But no executives. Not even, and it wasn't
Not
just
one executive.
not one
went
executive
to jail.
Not one executive went to jail. Not one executive was named. So there's this crazy thing where the company says we broke the law, and of course for me, I feel like it's the child in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. I say, who broke the law? How did the company break the law if no people broke the law? There must be people who made decisions.
It's people who make the decisions.
It's people who make decisions.
That's the thing, because in Say Nothing, there's people who take decisions. When the IRA decided that they're going to kill someone who they think is an informant, which is the case of Jim Mcconville, you are looking for the people who pull the trigger. We won't say anything else, because some people here would read the book after this conference. And in the case of the Sacklers, many people pull the trigger. Many people. And institutions and the government, the drug administration, the Food and Drug Administration pulled the trigger. And they were never prosecuted.
Yeah.
So the system goes.
The system lives on. Yeah. And I think, looking.
It's the system that makes it possible, this opioid crisis, not only the Sacklers.
Yeah, I mean, I say this explicitly in the book, and this in a way goes back to the point about me being selfish. I wrote about the Sacklers because I think they played a very special role at the beginning, and because I'm interested in families, and it was a story that I found appealing and I wanted to explore. I didn't write about them to suggest that they are the only people who are guilty when it comes to a public health crisis that has killed 500,000 people and taken a quarter of a century. There's lots of people, lots of parties. You can point fingers all over the place. And there's nothing in my choice to write about the Sacklers that suggests that they're the only ones guilty for the opioid crisis, in the same way that just because I chose to write about the Provos, the IRA, and say nothing, I'm not suggesting that they're at fault for all of the troubles and that there aren't fingers you could point elsewhere. It's a choice, but of course there are others, and I think what concerns me looking forward, wondering about what the next crisis will be, is how do you change people's behavior? And especially if it's like wealthy executives in my country.
Yeah.
But I'm sure the same would be true here. If people think that they could go to jail, if they think that there's a chance if they break the law or they do something really harmful and they do it for profit, if they think that there's any chance that they could be taken away from their children, humiliated, and sent to prison for some period of time, honestly, even if it's just like a week, it doesn't even have to be for years and years and years. I've seen this happen with white-collar criminals. They're terrified of prison. They do not want to go to prison for a night. If that threat is there, I think you will change behavior. If they think that the company can plead guilty and they can just move on to their next job, forget it. You're never going to see an end to this stuff.
We could be talking hours about corruption in Spain now, and I would explain to you how much time they spend in jail, which is a little time, and who gets in prison and who don't get in prison, and so we are not going to take Patrick time explaining what you already know, but if you are interested on that,
I am.
There's much to investigate.
Hey, any excuse to come back to Barcelona.
Because there's some room for a new investigation here.
Okay, all right.
And I think maybe with you,
we'll talk after.
We could. But that brings, George Bush, Jose Maria Aznar, who was the president of the Spanish government at the time of the Iraqi war, and Tony Blair, the three of them lied to us about the nuclear weapons in Iraq. And they haven't been prosecuted, even if later on everyone has admitted that they were lying. With governments, that's why I was asking you if they pressurize you not to stress in the role. They haven't? Never? In any of the...
A great deal of pressure from the Sacklers, but no pressure from the FDA.
Nothing? And afterwards, when you've published the books, that's another question that I wanted to put across, because you've been writing this second book from during the COVID pandemic. So phoning from home, getting all this information in, but not being able to go and see and go and see and go and interview. How was that process?
It was good and bad. I started working on the book really, not exactly full time because I was doing this podcast as well, but most of my job was the book, starting in the beginning of 2019. And so I had a solid a year and a little bit, to be able to travel all around and do reporting and gather things. And then when the pandemic hit, it changed things. I couldn't go to archives, which I was very frustrated about. Even today, there are some letters in a couple of archives that I'm obsessed with getting, and I still can't get in. It's too late now to even put them in the book, but I want to get them. Some letters Richard Sackler wrote years ago. But I did find, the thing that was funny is that I found that so much of the job for a journalist is calling strangers on the phone. And a lot of what I was doing for this book is I would look on LinkedIn and I would see that somebody worked at Purdue Pharma back in the 1980s, or whether this person might have known the Sacklers, or this person, I looked at their address and it looks like they shared an apartment building with, the Bobby Sackler, this guy who died, who I want to know about. And then I call them. I find phone numbers and I call them. And a lot of the time I'm also calling landlines, which people don't even pick up anymore, really. So it's not, it's a frustrating part of the job. But I found during the pandemic that everybody was at home alone, and like they had already watched everything on Netflix, and they were
everybody wanted to speak to you.
And they were sick of their husband or sick of their wife, and so what would happen is I would call, and people would pick up right away, and they would say hello, and I'd say I'm a writer and I'm working on a book, and they would say, a book, you say, like tell me about it.
Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. It was amazing to sort of the perfect scenario.
I don't have my kids to pick up from school
exactly.
today.
I got nowhere to go. So that was helpful, and then the writing of the book. I certainly wouldn't recommend it for everyone, but a global pandemic is not a bad time to sort of shut yourself in a room with no place to go and no one to see, and try and crank out a manuscript.
And there's a new story that's coming up, and which will fascinate you. That is about a song. Scorpions, the group, yeah. Winds of Change. Was the CIA the author of this song and not the Scorpions? This is the next investigation you are on?
Oh, I'm done. I'm done with that investigation. Do you know this song, people here? You do?
The whistle.
Yeah. So actually, I did this between the two books. I have this crazy friend who's somebody I've known for a long time, but was a source for me over the years for various stories, and he just knows many people in many different places. And this song, Wind of Change, was a big hit in Europe, and particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet bloc. And it came out right around the time the Berlin Wall fell, and then it was kind of an anthem for freedom, and it was like #1 everywhere when the Soviet Union collapsed. And 10 years ago, this friend of mine told me this crazy rumor, which is that the song wasn't written by the Scorpions, it was written by the CIA. And this is obviously an outlandish story, because the Scorpions are sort of like what we would call a hair metal band, big hair and leather pants and culturally speaking, like not what you think of when you think about the CIA. And so for a variety of reasons that I couldn't make that work as a piece of writing. And so I decided it should be a podcast. And so I made this podcast called Wind of Change.
We are going to pass on into questions from people, because there's a lot of people here who I'm sure they want to ask you questions. But I've read that you had worked in the Pentagon, being a special advisor for a while.
For a year, yeah.
Yeah, for a year?
Yeah.
In the Pentagon? Doing what?
So this is in 2010.
Yeah.
I moved to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And there was somebody who had been a source for me in the government on stories, and said, if you wanted to, you could get a fellowship. We'll give you a top secret clearance. You can come into the government for 1 year. And as long as you don't write about the classified stuff that you see, then you leave at the end, and you can, learn what you learn, but go back to the real world. So it was like I passed through the looking glass for a year.
That's wonderful.
It was wild. Well, I should say, it was for me, as somebody who had often thought about government and government secrecy and the bad things that governments do. The strange thing about the Pentagon is that when you get inside, it's like
spell it out. What?
Well, it's in the States we would say it's like the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. It's like a big bureaucracy with all these people. If you've seen the show The Office, it's more like The Office than it is like anything you would see it's all these people who kind of come in, and they have there's tons of money spent on stupid things, and everybody's protecting their own little pet projects and so forth. And so I learned a lot. I sort of felt like I was on safari. Kind of going through this strange place. But I also was just like, God, get me back to journalism.
Ok. Qui vol preguntar alguna cosa? Tenim preguntes potser, perquè això ho hem estat emetent en streaming, perquè aquí no hi cabia tothom. Espero que hagi anat bé l'abast tècnic que sempre ens amoïna això. Si hi ha algú que vulgui fer-li una pregunta al Patrick, aquí... Algú? Allà.
Hola, bona tarda. Tenim una pregunta de l'Alfonso Uteriño, que ens està seguint per streaming. I diu, No diguis res és un dels millors títols que he llegit en els darrers anys. Li pregunto si el Sinn Féin s'ha sentit molest o li ha fet arribar el seu descontent amb com explica el cas. Gràcies.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say that. Sinn Féin has said nothing about Say Nothing. I can only imagine that they're displeased about the book. You know, one of the big questions for me about Sinn Féin as a political party is that towards the end of Say Nothing, I write about when Gerry Adams was arrested for questioning in the murder of Jean Mcconville. And what I say is that in the US, if you had a politician who was arrested on suspicion of the murder of a widowed mother of 10, that politician's party would cast them out. They would just, you know, it was very mercenary. It was amazing to me that Sinn Féin stuck with Adams through that. I should say I probably wrote that before the ascendancy of Donald Trump. I've come to reevaluate the loyalty of American political parties, but I think in a weird way the Trump analogy is not a bad one in the sense that I think Adams has a cult of personality in Sinn Féin. I think he's a hugely important symbolic figure for them. So the book was awkward for him. I know he's been asked about it, and he has kind of deflected the questions. There are a couple of, you know, the book has not gotten many bad reviews, but it's gotten a few from people who are kind of, you know, very loyal to Adams, who have the impression that the whole book was designed as a kind of get Gerry Adams exercise, which I think if you read the book honestly, you realize it's not. And in fact, there's all kinds of people who really hate Adams who feel I was too sympathetic to him for one reason or another. Yeah, I mean, in terms of how troubled Adams is, I can tell you a funny story, which is that when the book came out in Ireland before it came out in the States. So it was the first place it came out, was in Ireland, in November 2019. And November 2018. And I went over for the launch of the book. And when I was in Dublin, it just so happened that Gerry Adams was also on book tour. And I wondered whether we might cross paths in the bookstore, you know, at a signing or something and have an awkward moment. And we didn't. But it was funny to me that we were both on book tour. And, you know, my book was this, this big volume about terrible war crimes during the Troubles, which argued that Gerry Adams ordered one of the most awful of these war crimes. And Gerry Adams was publishing a cookbook about the recipes that he would whip up for the lads when they were doing the peace process. And it was called, we'll have to see if this comes through in Catalan, but I think it was called the peas process, like peas like the food. It was a terrible.
But you ignore the peace process. The peace process is important. I mean, the IRA did what it did, and politically, the solution between the state, the British state, and the conflict in Northern Ireland had to go through the path to sit down and decide to stop that. And it was not only the IRA who did bad things, but also the other part. So it's not only this a murder, it's the whole story of this conflict that includes mothers in both sides. I mean, probably the feeling that the IRA had is he's choosing one mother as if the war was not with the state and with the conflict that we do have, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. But Jean Mcconville has a special role as a victim.
Yeah.
And I think that people in the IRA, and I know this having interviewed a bunch of them, people in the IRA, even people in Sinn Féin, feel a great sense of shame about what happened there.
Mm-hmm.
They feel as though a terrible mistake was made. And I think it's, So I don't know that that's. I mean, listen, this is a thing that as an outsider always frustrates me about the Troubles, but frankly, in the United States, we're so divided that we do the same thing where it's the kind of whataboutery, where, you say Gene Mcconville and they say, oh, but look at all the terrible things. Look, what about Bloody Sunday, And of course, the fact of Bloody Sunday and the guilt of those paratroopers for doing what they did doesn't negate what happened to Gene Mcconville.
Of course.
But there's this kind of strange tit for tat thing. Yeah, listen, I mean, on the
we have the same here with the ETA.
I'm certain. Yeah.
I mean, now there's a film called Mcconville, wonderful film about how one of the militants of the ETA felt because he was the one who shot Jauregui, who was a Spanish politician, and you could do the same because Josu Muguruza, who was a militant of ETA, was shot by the GAL, which was the paramilitary Spanish force that was working against ETA. I mean, you could do both sides.
Right, but to go back to our conversation a little while ago about denial, I think that this is the way it functions, right? Is that you get into this kind of endless litany of grievances where you show yours and then I show mine. But what ends up happening for groups and individuals is that doing that prevents them from saying, but what about Gene Mcconville?
Yeah, of course.
And actually evaluating what that means. The one last thing I would say on the peace process is just that in fairness to Adams, there's a line at the end of the book where I talk about how he knew. You might find him emotionally unsympathetic. You might think that he lies all day long, but he was the one who saw, in a way that Dolores Price and Brendan Hughes couldn't, frankly, that the conflict couldn't go on forever. There had to be a political settlement. The nature of a political settlement is compromise. And so, politically, I'm with Adams on that. And the fact that the book shows that much sympathy to him is something that for a lot of people who just spend their days obsessively hating Adams is upsetting.
Més preguntes. Aquí. No sé quina hora és. No tinc ni idea. Quina hora és? Val. I have no idea what time is it.
No idea.
No. Hola.
Hola.
Simplement volia fer-li una pregunta. És en relació amb el periodisme actual, no? Jo crec que des del meu punt de vista, és un periodisme d'entreteniment. No és un periodisme que busca la veritat. Jo no sé, jo parlo des d'aquí, els mitjans de comunicació que conec. No sé si al reste del món està passant el mateix, no? Que la veritat avui no interessa. No? La periodista que he conegut, que ha anat, l'única que he conegut, que ha anat a buscar la veritat de l'entrevistador i no l'ha deixat en pau fins que digués la veritat, amb coratge i amb honestedat, i perdoneu, jo no la conec personalment, i ho dic, i està precisament aquí, és la Mònica Terribas. Jo sempre he vist que anava a buscar la veritat.
Jo en conec més,
Jo no conec més. Bé, llavors, simplement és si estem realment en un món en què la veritat ja no importa.
Please.
Jo crec que sí que importa i que hi ha molts mitjans petits, alternatius, segurament non mainstream, que no estan encara en mans dels interessos dels grups mediàtics i no estan només pendents de quants exemplars venen i de quantes audiències fan de ràdio i televisió, i hi ha professionals al capdavant d'aquests mitjans que encara tenen la voluntat del servei públic, i n'hi ha molts que no, n'hi ha moltíssims que no. I hi ha molts periodistes que fan molt bé la seva feina i és una feina molt invisible, molt lenta, i que treballen perquè se sàpiga la veritat, i a vegades només, saps, els que tenim un micro o hem tingut un micro, perquè jo soc feliç avui aquí fent això, però fa temps que no puc fer aquesta feina, doncs segurament són més visibles. Però jo tinc molts companys que són molt bons i fan molt bé la seva feina. O sigui que jo tinc fe en el periodisme i tinc aules plenes a la universitat cada any d'estudiants joves superben preparats que no defalliran per escombrar el mercat en el sentit pervers del periodisme. I el Patrick, clar.
I wish I shared your optimism. I'm worried. I worry about it. I think that I mean, it's funny. So I've been talking about my own reporting for the New Yorker and in these books, but the reality is I'm very privileged. I'm speaking from a position of tremendous privilege to get to spend as much time as I do, to get to spend the resources that I do. When I talk about getting legal threats from the Sacklers, I have this great luxury, which is that I have lawyers at the New Yorker who say, we'll be okay, we'll stand by you. I have lawyers at my publisher who go through everything in it and they say, we think you're okay, and if you get sued, we'll stand by you so you're not on your own. Most journalists don't have the luxuries that I have. And so what I worry about is that this kind of reporting, to get to the truth, particularly when you're doing it about people who are very resourceful and might try to shut you down, it's expensive. It's expensive to produce. And the business model that used to exist, driven by advertising primarily, isn't there anymore. And as you say, I mean, the pressures move toward entertainment and clicks and a kind of lighter, fizzier...
Beyoncé.
Pardon me?
Beyoncé.
Beyoncé, right, exactly. I still think we should do that piece. But so I worry about that, and I think it's a problem of the business model, because it's not that you don't have lots of young, smart, driven journalists and aspiring journalists coming out of school every day, but the problem is that on their own, without some kind of institutional support, it's going to be hard for them. Not impossible, but it's going to be harder for them and more precarious for them to do this kind of work. So, for me, all I can do is kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other and hope that people support this work, and that alternative models, in the States, we have a lot of these kind of public-private models and nonprofits, which there's ProPublica, which is a great organization, which gives support to local journalism, for instance, which is disappearing. And my hope is that through a series of innovations like that, there will be a way to continue this kind of work, because I think without it, if you look at the story of OxyContin and the Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, it's a story in which the FDA failed. The Department of Justice in Washington failed. State governments failed. The medical establishment failed. It's really only because of journalists, and I tell some of their stories in the book. I'm not talking about myself here, people before me, journalists who said, people are taking this painkiller and they're dying. What's going on? People should answer questions. It's only because of that work that we ever got any kind of an accountability or a sense of the crisis.
Yeah.
Bé, jo volia fer una pregunta que va una mica en la línia del que ja ha preguntat l'altra persona per allà, i és més sobre la teva pròpia trajectòria professional, de com vas començar a interessar-te pel periodisme d'investigació, i què li diries a una persona que està intentant començar en aquest món? Perquè jo mateixa comparteixo la teva desesperança pel periodisme, i jo m'agradaria poder dedicar-m'hi, però no veig com les possibilitats o les oportunitats o realment mitjans que tinguin un interès per aquest periodisme d'investigació, que potser és com idealització del passat, però jo veig que fa anys em feia molt bon producte i ara com queden pocs d'això.
Some advice.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I'm glad to think that you want to do this work, because we need it. And, my own trajectory is probably... my trajectory would be a good one to look at if you want to know how not to do it.
Pentagon?
Because it took me a long time to figure it out, in part because I was a little bit like you in the sense that when I was in college, even earlier, I knew that I wanted to write for a living, and I started figuring out that I wanted to write nonfiction. The way I figured that out was by writing a lot of terrible fiction and people saying you really should not write fiction. I couldn't figure out how to operationalize that. I couldn't figure out how to get a job doing it. It was a different time. This is in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And so what I did was I just stayed in school and I kept going to school because I figured I'll keep going to school, I'll try and make it work, and if I don't make it work, at least I'll have all these degrees and I can find some other job. So I did a master's degree and I did another master's degree, and that whole time I was sending off articles trying to get assignments and not getting any assignments. And then I went to law school, which I would really not recommend that you do if you want to be a journalist. Not because you don't learn valuable things, because I did, but because it's a very expensive way to learn those valuable things. I went to law school, and it was really only in law school that I started writing professionally, and I wasn't even able then to get stuff at magazines. I got a book deal to write my first book. Because it happened that some stuff I had investigated in graduate school, the US government and the way in which it did surveillance, the National Security Agency, and actually surveillance in Europe, was being investigated by the European Parliament. And so I wrote a master's thesis at the London School of Economics about that. And I came back to go to law school, and then September 11th happened. And so suddenly this quite obscure thing that I knew just a little bit about was more in the news. How does the NSA work? What kind of global eavesdropping is the US doing? And so that way I was able to get a deal to write the book. And I slowly kind of learned investigative work on the job, really. I mean, just through kind of trial and error in a way. But here's the advice that I would give you. Go out there and talk to people. Talk to people with a notebook. Record them on your phone if they'll let you. Try and discover stories that aren't being written about that you think are important. Find the people who are at the heart of those stories. Find the most interesting people. Sometimes you need to talk to 19 people, and the 20th person you talk to, that's your character. And you kind of know it, right? Because they sort of draw you in. And then think about what it is about their story that you most respond to. That's the thing that you want to tell the reader. And that can be in a 300-word article or a 300-page book. I always think about, sometimes I'll go and do an interview and it can last 2-3 hours, and then I'll come home and make dinner for my wife and we'll talk about the day. And I don't tell her every single thing that happened in the 3-hour interview. I tell her the 2 best parts, or the best line. And that's usually the thing that wants to be in the piece. I think it took me a long time to realize this as a journalist, because I would transcribe the 3-hour interview and go through every single thing and give all this thought to what I wanted to put in the article. I think that's not the best approach. The best filter is your own memory, what sticks with you, and then what would you transmit? What would you tell to somebody else? You meet a friend for a drink at a bar and you say, I just had the craziest conversation. And then he said, that's the thing that you put in the piece. And so I think, do it. You gotta love it, because it's an unstable way to make a living. But I think it's the best job in the world.
Moltíssimes gràcies. Gràcies a tothom. Ho deixem aquí perquè necessitem que el Patrick tingui temps per firmar. Ara, aquí o allà, en algun lloc que ara us indicarem, podreu fer que us signi o la versió catalana o la castellana, perquè Reservoir Books i Periscopi han vingut a oferir-vos la possibilitat. Recomanem moltíssim aquest llibre, de veritat es llegeix tots dos, Say Nothing, no diguis res, i també The Empire of Pain. Un plaer enorme. Great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you all for coming.
Gràcies a tothom.
Too many problems in an estimated time, probably so.